The machine couldn't lie. It had cross-referenced every star, nebula, and galaxy visible from Earth for 50,000 years. Yet this 4,000-year-old burial shroud, woven by supposedly primitive desert nomads, depicted none of it. Instead, it was a perfect, mathematically precise map of a sky that did not exist. Dr. Kaelen Rhys stared at the impossible data burning on his screen. His scientific method had just given him empirical proof of the supernatural. The sand of the Taklamakan Desert stretched into a shimmering, heat-distorted infinity. It was a place known as the Sea of Death, a land that promised to swallow you whole and leave no trace. Cutting through this desolation was a convoy of 3 black government-marked SUVs, their tinted windows reflecting the oppressive glare of the hazy sun. They moved with a purpose that felt alien in the vast emptiness, kicking up plumes of ancient dust that hung in the still air like ghosts. Inside the lead vehicle, the jarring, bone-rattling ride over the uneven terrain might as well have been a glide on smooth asphalt. Dr. Kaelen Rhys was oblivious. His world had shrunk to the small, illuminated screen of the portable mass spectrometer cradled in his lap. His hands, steady and sure, made minute adjustments to the device's calibration settings. His movements a small island of precise, predictable order in the chaotic landscape outside. At 40, Rhys' face was sharp, etched with the faint lines of chronic fatigue and an even deeper, more ingrained intensity. He was a man who found comfort not in people, but in data points. Not in faith, but in the unwavering certainty of the scientific method. He set the spectrometer aside, its internal mechanisms now humming in perfect harmony, and picked up a tablet. On the screen was the official request from the Chinese Ministry of Antiquities. The language was a masterpiece of political obfuscation, full of phrases like a new era of cultural cooperation and a joint venture to illuminate our shared heritage. Rhys let out a short, quiet scoff, a sound of pure, undiluted skepticism. Shared heritage. He knew what that meant. It meant finding evidence that fit a pre-approved narrative. It meant his job was not to discover the truth, but to validate a conclusion that had already been written. He was a tool, a highly specialized, expensive tool, being brought in to lend Western credibility to a state-sponsored press release. His fingers tapped against the cool metal casing of the device beside him. The machine wouldn't lie. The machine couldn't be pressured or persuaded. It would simply report the facts. And in the end, the facts were all that mattered. The convoy crested a final, massive dune, and the excavation site sprawled before them. It was a shocking intrusion of modernity on the ancient world. A small city of prefabricated labs, white canvas tents, and communications arrays was laid out with the rigid geometry of a military base. This was not the charming, dusty dig of popular imagination. This was a high-tech, high-stakes operation. As Rhys stepped out of the air-conditioned SUV, the desert heat hit him like a physical blow. A man was already walking toward him, his hand extended. He was in his 50s, wearing a pristine dark suit that seemed to defy the scorching sun and the dust that coated everything. This was Director Lin. His handshake was firm, his smile polite, but his eyes held the cool, unwavering confidence of a man with absolute authority. Dr. Rhys, welcome. We are most honored to have a scientist of your caliber joining our humble endeavor, Lin said, his English perfect, a diplomat's practiced warmth coating every word. Director, thank you for the invitation, Rhys replied, his tone professional, guarded. Lin began the tour, his gestures broad and proprietary, as if he were showing off a new factory rather than an archaeological site. He spoke of the profound historical implications of the find, painting a picture of a long-lost branch of the Silk Road, where ancient Chinese traders peacefully coexisted and mixed with Western travelers. It was a beautiful story, a narrative of harmonious unity that served the present day far more than it likely served the past. Rhys listened politely, nodding at the appropriate moments, his mind already cataloguing the questions Lyn's narrative conveniently ignored. How did they get here? Why did they stay? And how did they die? Our initial carbon dating places them at nearly 4,000 years old, Lyn continued, stopping before the largest structure, a squat, windowless building from which a constant, low hum emanated. An astonishing age. It will rewrite the history of cross-continental migration. He gestured toward the reinforced steel door. And this is where your expertise is most needed, the heart of our discovery. He paused, his gaze locking with Rhys. We are confident your analysis will corroborate our findings and put to rest any unfounded speculation. The message was clear. There was only one acceptable truth here. The moment the heavy door of the refrigerated tent swung open, the biting cold swept over Rhys, a sterile, chemical chill that smelled of preserved time. The constant hum of the climate control systems was the only sound. Inside, the world was stainless steel and fluorescent light, and on a series of long steel tables lay the reason he had traveled halfway across the world: the mummies. Rhys felt his carefully constructed professional skepticism evaporate, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated scientific awe. The reports, the photos, none of it had prepared him for the reality. They were perfectly, impossibly preserved. These were not the desiccated skeletal remains he was used to. The skin was intact, stretched taut over high cheekbones and strong jaws. The features were distinctly, undeniably Caucasian. Wisps of hair, ranging from fiery red to a pale sun-bleached blonde, clung to their skulls. He saw eyelashes, still delicate and curled. He saw the faint patterns of woven textiles still clinging to their bodies, the colors muted but still visible after 4 millennia. He moved toward the nearest table, his gloved hand hovering just above a male figure. The man was tall, his face peaceful, almost noble. Rhys leaned closer, his mind racing, formulating 100 different tests, 1,000 questions. The aridity of the desert, the saline soil, those were factors, yes. They could explain a degree of natural mummification. But this was something else. This was a level of preservation that defied established decomposition models. It was as if they had died only a season ago. As he was lost in his scientific reverence, a quiet sound broke his concentration. 2 of the local Uyghur workers were clearing away some packing materials nearby. One of them, an old woman with a face like a wrinkled map, glanced at the mummy, then at Rhys. She murmured something to her companion in their native tongue, a low, urgent whisper. It was not meant for him, but in the tomb-like silence of the tent, the words carried. Rhys didn't understand the language, but the young, nervous translator assigned to his team happened to be standing by the door and flinched as if struck. He caught the young man's eye, raising a questioning eyebrow. The translator hesitated, looking from Rhys to the old woman May, as if caught between 2 powerful forces. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. She says it is dangerous to be here." Rhys' expression hardened slightly. "Dangerous how?" The translator swallowed, refusing to look at the mummies. "She says, disturb the sleeping guardians, and you will hear the sky scream." Rhys held his skeptical gaze for a moment before dismissing it with a subtle shake of his head. Folklore. Every ancient site had its local curses, its ghost stories. It was the human mind's attempt to give meaning to the unknown, to dress up death in the garb of mythology. It was fascinating from an anthropological standpoint, but it was not data. It was noise. And yet, as he turned back to the eerily serene face of the 4,000-year-old man, he couldn't entirely shake the phrase. Sky scream. The body on the table was a fact. It was a collection of atoms, a puzzle of proteins and DNA he was here to solve. But for the first time in his career, looking at the impossible truth lying before him, Kaelen Rhys felt a cold, unfamiliar seed of doubt begin to sprout in the sterile, orderly garden of his mind. The science was a mystery, but the superstition had given that mystery a terrifying name. Night fell over the sea of death, bringing a profound, unnerving silence that the thin walls of the prefabricated lab could not keep out. Inside, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, Dr. Kaelen Rhys had found his sanctuary. The chaotic emotions of the day, the awe, the political pressure, the unsettling whisper of a local curse were banished here. This was a place of order, of process, of fact. He worked alone, the rhythmic beeping of his machines a comforting liturgy. He had taken several microscopic samples from the primary male mummy, the one the old woman had called a guardian. Swabs from the lungs, fibers from the burial shroud, dust from within the folds of the manus leather boots. Now, he fed them into the maw of his mass spectrometer. The machine whirred to life, its internal lasers vaporizing the samples, analyzing their atomic weight, breaking them down into their fundamental truths. Rhys watched the monitor, his eyes tracing the familiar peaks and valleys of the resulting graph. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, the building blocks of life. Then, trace elements consistent with the regional soil. Everything was as it should be, until it wasn't. A series of small, unfamiliar peaks appeared on the graph. Rhys frowned, leaning closer. The molecular weights didn't correspond to any catalogued mineral or compound native to the Taklamakan. He isolated the signature, running it against a global database. Nothing. He reran the sample. The same unknown peaks appeared, sharp and clear. This was not an error. Alongside these mystery compounds, the machine flagged another substance. It was organic, and the concentration was massive. He focused the analysis, and the screen resolved the finding into a single, unbelievable identification. Nelumbo nucifera var, nigra, black lotus. Rhys felt a jolt. He knew the name. It was a rare, cultivated variant, infamous in ancient pharmacological texts for its potent, dangerous hallucinogenic properties. It was a plant that grew in lush, wet climates thousands of miles south of this desert. The concentration in the lung tissue suggested the man had not just been near it. He had been inhaling it, perhaps for years. It was an impossible fact, a piece of data as out of place as an iceberg in the sand. His machine, his bastion of logic, was telling him a ghost story. The next morning, Rhys stood before Director Lin, tablet in hand. The Director-S office was an oasis of minimalist luxury, a stark contrast to the functional chaos of the lab. Lin sat behind a large, empty desk, a porcelain cup of tea steaming gently beside him. He listened as Rhys presented his findings, his face a polite, unreadable mask. "The spectral analysis is conclusive," Rhys said, pointing to the graph on his tablet. "Unknown organic compounds, and a massive quantity of black lotus pollen. This species is not native to this continent, let alone this desert. This changes the entire context of the find." Lin did not look at the tablet. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, his eyes fixed on Rhys. "Contamination," he said finally, the word flat and absolute. "There are dozens of digs within 1,000 kilometers. Pollen travels on the wind. It is the only logical explanation. Director, the concentration is far too high for airborne contamination," Rhys countered, keeping his voice steady. "We're talking about levels consistent with direct, long-term exposure. Furthermore, the compounds I cannot identify are likely a flaw in your equipment-S calibration." "Doctor," Lin cut in smoothly. His voice was still quiet, but it now carried a sharp metallic edge. "Your machine has been transported across the globe. It is understandable that it may require adjustments." He placed his cup down with a soft click. "Your job, Dr. Rhys, is to provide us with verifiable data on the mummy's age and migratory origin. Your job is not to chase botanical fantasies based on faulty readings. Am I clear?" The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct order, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of professional courtesy. Rhys felt a surge of frustration, hot and acidic. This wasn't science, it was censorship. He simply nodded, the muscles in his jaw tight. Crystal clear, Director. That night, the lab felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. Thwarted by Lynn, Rhys turned his defiant energy elsewhere. If the microscopic evidence was to be ignored, he would focus on the macroscopic. He projected a high-resolution, multi-spectrum image of the main Guardian S burial shroud onto the large wall screen. The textile filled his vision, a landscape of faded ochre and indigo. To a casual observer, it was beautiful, intricate folk art. But Rhys had spent years studying ancient methods of information storage. He knew that before writing, humanity had used knots, colors, and weaves to record knowledge. And this was no simple pattern. It was a tapestry of staggering complexity. There were no repeating motifs, no decorative flourishes. It was pure, geometric information. He engaged the imaging software, isolating specific sections of the weave. He measured the precise spacing between certain knots, the exact angle of the threads, the sequence of colors. It was painstaking, laborious work. A pattern began to emerge, not a visual one, but a mathematical one. The spacing of the knots followed a logarithmic progression. The color shifts corresponded to prime numbers. This wasn't TA blanket. It was a data file, it was a language, and Rhys was determined to crack the code. He began the arduous process of transcribing it, converting thousands of physical points into a single massive dataset. He would let the evidence speak for itself, and he would make it scream. The hours bled together. The silence of the desert was broken only by the soft clicking of Rhys' keyboard and the hum of the servers processing the immense file. He had converted the entire textile into a complex matrix of coordinates. His first assumption was that it was a map of the land, a guide to some forgotten place. But the coordinates made no terrestrial sense. He stared at the screen, at the swirling, abstract patterns of the converted data, and a thought struck him, a wild hunch born of desperation. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. Sky Scream. He remembered the stargazers of ancient civilizations, how they mapped their heavens onto temple walls and clay tablets. With a few keystrokes, he fed his dataset into a stellar cartography program. The software was designed to identify constellations and track celestial bodies. He initiated the primary function, compare the input data against all known historical star charts. The program began its work, the screen flashing through overlays of Babylonian, Egyptian, and early Greek celestial maps. For each one, the result was the same. The coordinates from the shroud twisted and turned, refusing to align with any known view of Earth's sky. Rhys leaned back, a grim satisfaction settling in. He had proven it was nothing, just a meaningless, abstract pattern. He had reached another dead end. He was about to close the program when the final comparison completed. The program flashed its conclusion in stark red letters that seemed to burn in the darkness of the lab. No match found. He stared at the words. It wasn't just that it didn't match a specific culture's star chart. It didn't match any part of the recorded human sky. The program had cross-referenced every star, nebula, and galaxy visible from Earth at any point in the last 50,000 years. And this map, this 4,000-year-old textile woven by a supposedly primitive people, depicted none of it. It was a perfect, detailed, mathematically precise map of a sky that did not exist. Kaelen Rhys felt the floor drop out from under him. The data was irrefutable, and the data was impossible. The red letters burned in the dark of the lab. No match found. The words were a final, absolute judgment from the only authority Kaelen Rhys truly trusted. For 2 days, he had been trapped in a loop of denial. He reran the analysis, checked his code for errors, even rescanned a different section of the shroud. The result was always the same. The data was perfect. The conclusion was impossible. His scientific method had led him to the edge of a cliff, and there was nowhere left to go. The rational world had run out. Defeated, Rhys finally left the sterile cold of his lab and walked out into the dusk. The oppressive heat of the day was beginning to yield to a cool desert evening. The workers' camp was a world away from the rigid order of the excavation site. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting lamb. Families were gathered, their quiet conversations a soft murmur in the twilight. He felt like a ghost here, an outsider drifting through a life he couldn't comprehend. He found May sitting on a small stool outside her tent, her hands busy mending a piece of brightly coloured cloth. Rhys approached slowly, his young translator, Alim, trailing nervously behind him. He held a printout of the textile S geometric pattern. "May," he began, his voice softer than usual. Alim translated. The old woman didn't look at the paper in his hand, her dark, knowing eyes fixed on his face. She spoke a few sharp words in Uyghur. "She says the story is not for outsiders," Alim relayed, his voice trembling slightly. "It is not for men who listen only with their ears and not their spirit." This was the moment where Rhys, the scientist, would normally walk away, dismissing the encounter as a dead end. But he was already at a dead end. "Please," Rhys said, his voice imbued with a genuine curiosity that surprised even himself. "I don't understand what I am seeing. The patterns, they don't make sense. I believe you know something that I don't." He wasn't using authority. He was admitting ignorance. It was a language she seemed to understand. May studied his face for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded slowly and began to speak, her voice a low, rhythmic chant. Alim translated, his own awe coloring the words. "They were not explorers," she began. "They were the exiles. They came from a star that fell from the sky a long, long time ago. They did not come seeking riches or land. They came as jailers." She paused, her gaze distant. "They carried a sickness with them, not of the body, but of the mind. The sky scream. A voice that is not a voice. A consciousness that whispers madness into the spaces between thoughts. It broke their world, and they fled here to contain it, to this empty place where its screams would not be heard." Rhys listened, captivated, the pieces of his own impossible puzzle clicking into place. But the scream was a prisoner that rattled its cage. May continued. "So they bound it. They wove its prison from the threads of the world, each knot, each weave, a bar on the cage, a lock on the door." She finally glanced at the paper in his hand. "That is not a map of where they were. It is a diagram of the cage they built." Rhys felt a chill despite the warm air. "The pollen," he said, almost to himself. "The black lotus." May looked at him, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. "To build a cage, you must see the bars." They drank the dust of the black lotus in their tea. It opened their eyes. It let them see the paths between the stars, to see the shape of the cage as it needed to be woven in the great black sky. Back in the lab, May's words echoed in the silence, a piece of folklore that held the terrifying ring of truth. "See the shape of the cage's bars in the night sky." He stared at the no-match found error on his screen. His entire approach had been wrong. He had been looking backward, trying to match the pattern to a sky that was. But May's story spoke of a cage, a lock, a design. It wasn't a record. It was a blueprint. It was a warning. A wild, intuitive leap, an act of pure, unscientific faith took hold of him. He turned back to the stellar cartography program. He dove deep into its parameters, the domain of astrophysicists and theoretical modelers. With trembling fingers, he began to change the variables. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was hypothesizing based on a myth. He changed the temporal setting, spooling it forward, not back. 10,000 years, 50,000. He altered the point of observation, detaching it from Earth, sending his virtual eye soaring out of the solar system, across the galaxy. He was aiming blind, guided only by the words of an old woman and a desperate hope that the universe was infinitely stranger than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He was betraying every principle of his discipline, and he had never felt more certain. He set the final parameters, a guess so absurd it felt like madness. A vantage point in the Kepler 186 system, a star system nearly 500 light-years away, and a temporal projection 80,000 years into Earth's future. He took a deep breath and hit enter. The program began to churn. Terabytes of data, star positions, galactic drift, gravitational lensing streamed across the screen. The processor fans in the server rack whined, straining under the impossible calculations. The progress bar crept across the monitor with agonizing slowness. Rhys sat motionless, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it. The moment his career ended in ridicule, or the moment his entire reality was irrevocably broken. The processing finished. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The screen was blank, and then a single, soft chime echoed in the silent lab. The screen flickered, and two images resolved into one. On the left, the intricate geometric pattern from the 4,000-year-old burial shroud. On the right, the projected star field from a world humanity had not yet reached, in a future no one could predict. They slid together, overlaying with microscopic precision. Every knot, every thread, every angle of the ancient weave aligned perfectly with a star, a nebula, a galactic cluster. It was a perfect match. Rhys stared, unable to breathe. His mind, his rigorously logical, evidence-based mind, simply stopped. It was not a map. It was not a blueprint. It was a prophecy, written in wool and dye 4 millennia ago. It was a piece of information that could not exist. The computer had just given him empirical, verifiable proof of the supernatural. A profound wave of vertigo washed over him, a feeling not of falling, but of the entire world, the entire solid ground of reason and law and physics, falling away from under him. The screen bathed his face in its impossible golden glow, and on it was the face of a man staring into the abyss, having just discovered that the abyss was staring back. He sat like that for a long time, the impossible star chart burning into his retinas. His hands were shaking. His entire life's work, his belief system, had been built on the foundation that the universe was knowable, that its secrets would eventually yield to methodical inquiry. That foundation had just been pulverized. He looked across the lab to the secure case on his workbench. Inside was the small sealed vial containing the concentrated sample of black lotus pollen, the first anomaly. He looked back at the screen, the second anomaly. His scientific mind, shattered but not broken, raced to connect the two impossible facts. A correlation so strong, it demanded a theory of causation. He pulled up the audio file of his conversation with May, his finger finding the exact spot. Her voice, filtered through the computer's speakers, filled the lab. They drank the dust of the black lotus to see the paths between the stars. He looked at the pollen. He looked at the star chart. The path was there, on the screen. But it was incomplete. It was a cage without a key. A terrifying, yet perfectly logical idea began to form in the ruins of his worldview. It was an insane, unethical, unforgivable breach of every scientific protocol he had ever held sacred. But it was the only step left. He had to see the path for himself. The sterile quiet of his living quarters was a tomb. The impossible star chart, still glowing on his tablet, was its epitaph. Kaelen Rhys stood before the small desk, the vial of black lotus pollen held between his thumb and forefinger. This was the line, the demarcation between science and madness, and he was about to erase it. With a final steadying breath, he began the procedure. He switched on a small digital camera, positioning it to capture the desk and his torso. The red recording light blinked like a warning beacon. He leaned in, his voice strained but meticulously controlled, forcing the familiar ritual of the scientific method onto an act of pure heresy. Log entry. Unsanctioned toxicological analysis. Subject K. Rhys. He paused, the words feeling foreign and absurd. The sample is an unknown organic compound, tentatively identified as Nelumbo nucifera pollen. Purpose of ingestion is to verify anecdotal accounts regarding its psychoactive properties and potential for inducing patterned visual phenomena. He was lying to himself, to the camera, to whatever remained of his career. This wasn't about verification. It was about surrender. His hands, moving with the ingrained precision of a surgeon, measured out a dose of the fine, dark powder. 200 micrograms. He tapped it into a glass of purified water, stirring it with a sterile rod until the liquid turned a murky, opaque grey. He lifted the glass. For a fraction of a second, he saw his reflection in the dark water, a pale, haunted face on the brink of self-destruction. Then, he closed his eyes and drank it in one swift, decisive swallow. The water tasted of dust, an ancient, bitter earth. He sat back in the chair, placed his hands on the desk, and waited for the abyss to open. It did not open. It shattered. The world did not fade. It fractured into a million points of shrieking geometric light. The walls of his room dissolved into a roaring cascade of fractal patterns. The clinical hum of the air conditioner became a deafening chord that vibrated through his bones. He felt a pressure that was not physical, a weight as if a dead star had been placed upon his soul, the gravity of 1 billion years of silence. He was no longer in the room. He was adrift in a cold, non-Euclidean void, watching vast, impossible structures twist and turn in the darkness. He felt a wave of pure, primal terror wash over him, but it was not his own. It was a shared memory, the collective psychic scream of the exiles as they performed the first binding. He saw them, faces pale with cosmic dread, weaving the threads, chanting the rites, their minds straining against an unseen, overwhelming force. And then he heard it, the sky scream. It was not a sound. It was a wave of pure psychic entropy, a universal shriek of wrongness that tore at the fabric of his consciousness. It was the anti-thought, the dissolution of logic and reason into raw, screaming chaos. He understood in that instant why they had fled, why they had sacrificed everything to build a cage. Then, through the chaos, he saw the star map. But it was not a flat image on a screen. It was a living, breathing thing. The stars were nodes of brilliant light, and the woven threads were pulsing conduits of energy. It was a circuit diagram of impossible complexity and scale, a quantum lock designed to hold back the screaming void. He saw how the pieces fit, how the energy flowed, how the cage functioned. The knowledge poured into him, not as data to be analyzed, but as a truth to be experienced. The Black Lotus had opened his eyes. He saw the cage. The return was a violent expulsion. Rhys woke up on the cold floor of his quarters, his body drenched in sweat and racked with uncontrollable shivering. The camera S battery was dead, its red light extinguished. The door to his room was open, splintered at the frame. Director Lin stood over him, flanked by 2 imposing guards. His face was a mask of cold, triumphant fury. The room was a wreck. Papers were scattered. The chair was overturned. Lin's gaze fell upon the empty glass on the desk. He looked back down at the incoherent, trembling scientist on the floor. This was the final piece of evidence he needed. The foreigner was not just insubordinate. He was unstable, a drug addict, a disgrace. "It seems your research has taken a toll, Doctor," Lin said, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured to the guards. "Escort Dr. Rhys to his quarters. He is to be confined there until arrangements can be made for his departure." He looked down at Rhys one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. His work here is finished. As the guards hauled him to his feet, Rhys tried to speak, to explain, but the words were a meaningless babble. He had touched a cosmic truth, and his reward was to be treated like a common criminal. His authority, his access, his entire world, stripped away by the mundane fist of bureaucracy. Locked in his room, the hours passed in a feverish haze. A guard was posted outside his door. He was a prisoner. The visions had receded, but the knowledge they had burned into his mind remained. A permanent after-image seared onto his soul. The sky scream was quiet, but he knew it was there, waiting, pressing against the bars of its ancient cage. He had to act. He found a pen left behind in the sweep of his room and a stack of clean paper napkins on the nightstand. With frantic, desperate energy, he began to sketch. His hand flew across the flimsy paper, not drawing with memory, but transcribing a truth that was now part of him. He drew the swirling, geometric patterns of the psychic conduits, the locking mechanisms he had seen in the vision, the circuits that connected the stellar nodes. When he was done, he sat back, his breathing ragged. He powered on his tablet, his hands shaking, and brought up the image of the textile shroud. He held one of his napkin sketches next to the screen. His heart stopped. The jagged, alien geometry from his vision fit perfectly into the negative spaces of the ancient weave. They were the missing pieces. The master keys to the celestial lock. The star map showed the cage, but the vision had shown him how the cage worked. A breathless, triumphant laugh escaped his lips. Director Lin had taken his lab, his equipment, his freedom. But he had left him with the one thing that now mattered. He didn't just have the map of the cage anymore. He had the key. From the darkness of his confinement, a new kind of clarity had emerged. Kaelen Rhys was no longer a scientist waiting for data. He was a physician who had diagnosed a terminal illness. The time for observation was over. The time for intervention was now. The guard outside his door was a predictable variable, the electronic lock a simple circuit. Peering through the crack in his door, he waited for the guard-S patrol to take him to the far end of the hallway. Then he moved. He jammed a piece of metal, a spoon handle sharpened against the concrete floor, into the electrical conduit box next to his door. A shower of brilliant blue sparks, a loud crackle, and the entire block of quarters plunged into darkness. Shouts of confusion echoed down the hall. That was the distraction. In the ensuing chaos, he slipped out his window and melted into the shadows of the compound, a ghost in the machine. He clutched the only two things he needed: the napkin sketches of the cager circuits and a single, sharp scalpel from his medical kit. He was no longer moving like an academic. He was moving like a man on a mission, fueled by a terrible and certain purpose. His goal, a single point of cold, sterile light in the desert night, the refrigerated tomb. The air inside the tent was colder than he remembered, charged with a low, almost subsonic hum that vibrated deep in his bones. The Guardian lay on its steel slab, a silent sentinel at the heart of the storm. Rhys stood before it, his notes in one hand, the scalpel in the other. He knew what he had to do. The hum was growing louder, the pressure in the air thickening. He was about to make the first move when the door crashed open, flooding the tomb with harsh white light. Director Lin stood there, flanked by two armed guards. "Step away from the artifact, Doctor," Lin commanded, his voice shaking with rage. Rhys turned slowly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace, but he did not step away. "You have to listen to me, Director. It's not an artifact. It's a device." He pointed to his frantic sketches with the scalpel. "This isn't a person, not anymore. It is a biological capacitor, designed to contain a hostile consciousness through principles of quantum entanglement and harmonic resonance. The weave of the shroud, the orientation of the body, the mineral content of the bones, it's all part of a circuit." Lin stared at him, his face a mask of cold pity. "You are insane," he whispered. "You have lost your mind." He gestured to the guards. "Take him." As the guards moved forward, the world broke. A violent tremor ripped through the earth, throwing them all off balance. A case of instruments crashed to the floor. A metal support beam groaned, bending under the strain. The low hum in the tent intensified exponentially, exploding into a discordant psychic shriek that pierced their minds. The guards dropped their weapons, clutching their heads and screaming in agony. Lynn stumbled back, his face white with terror, his dogmatic certainty vaporized in an instant. Rhys, insulated by the dregs of the Black Lotus in his system, gritted his teeth against the psychic assault. He looked at the Guardian. The ancient linen wrappings around its chest were visibly fraying, thin black lines of dust seeping from within as the immense pressure sought release. The cage was breaking. There was no time. Ignoring the chaos around him, Rhys turned back to the mummy. His mind was a sea of tranquility amidst the storm. He saw the circuit diagram from his vision, overlaid perfectly on the body before him. His hands were steady. Following the schematics from his vision, he brought the scalpel down. It was not an act of violence or vandalism. It was an act of surgery. He didn't slash or tear. He made one small, precise cut on a specific, complex glyph woven over the mummy's heart, severing a single, crucial thread. He was completing a circuit, rerouting the energy flow, reinforcing the lock. Silence. The tremor stopped. The psychic shriek vanished, leaving behind only a ringing in the ears and the smell of ozone. The pressure in the air was gone. The mummy's wrappings were still. The guards slowly picked themselves up, looking around in a state of dumbfounded shock. Director Lynn stared at Rhys, then at the mummy, his mouth agape, his mind utterly incapable of processing what he had just witnessed. Rhys stood over the Guardian, breathing heavily, his scientific curiosity replaced by a profound and humbling reverence. He had not defeated a monster. He had reinforced a prison and honored the sacrifice of its ancient jailers. Weeks later, in an anonymous office in Beijing, Rhys completed his final report. The official version was a masterpiece of scientific obfuscation. The tremor was attributed to unrecorded, localized seismic activity. The damage to the tomb was minimal. The project, he concluded, had yielded valuable data, but was too politically sensitive to continue. He recommended the site be sealed indefinitely to preserve its integrity. He gave them a story they could accept, a truth they could live with. But there was a second report, a private addendum, encrypted with a key known only to him, lodged deep in a secure academic server. In it, he told the real story. He reclassified the Tarim Mummies, giving them a designation that would never appear in any textbook. Subject class, Archaeo-Containment system. He stated in no uncertain terms that they were not artifacts to be studied, but a functioning 4,000-year-old bioquantum device that had to be protected and left undisturbed at all costs. He had not abandoned science. He had been forced to expand its boundaries to include a truth he could now prove, but which the world was not, and might never be, ready to understand. His journey from arrogant pragmatist to wise protector was complete. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a guardian too. What I find so compelling about Dr. Rhys' journey isn't just that he discovered something impossible, but how he was forced to understand it. He begins as a man who trusts only the clean, hard language of data. Anything else, folklore, myth, warnings from an elder, is just noise, a distraction from the facts. But the story's brilliant twist is that the noise turned out to be the instruction manual. The scientific facts he uncovered, the pollen and the star map, were meaningless without the context of the superstition. The myth of the sky scream wasn't an alternative to the truth. It was the key that unlocked it. His machines gave him the what, but May's story gave him the why. And in the end, Rhys doesn't choose one over the other. He doesn't abandon science for belief. He synthesizes them. He uses a surgeon's scalpel to perform a ritualistic act, using mystical knowledge to solve a quantum problem. His final report acknowledges this new reality. a scientific explanation for the public, and a more complex, unsettling truth kept hidden. It suggests that some facts are so strange, they require a framework beyond our own to even begin to comprehend. It makes you wonder about the nature of knowledge itself. What do you think is the bigger leap of faith? Believing in an ancient myth, or believing in data that tells you the impossible is real?